And then when those were sort of excavated and publicized in the 19th century, I think everybody just went, oh boy, and just ran with it and was like, they had horns on their hats, tell everyone.
Hello and welcome back to LizCapism. This is the first in what I hope to be a series about how the 19th century, and particularly the Victorians, have defined so much about our shared ideas about the past and how they got it spectacularly wrong a lot of the time. So yeah, basically we're going to be talking about why it's all the Victorians' fault.
Yay, Victorians.
I am not a professional historian, archaeologist, or archivist, so my aim is to reach out to experts who might be able to help me sort fact from fiction and help illuminate not only what the Victorians got wrong, but also where their ideas came from and why they have stayed with us centuries later. My first topic is The Vikings, featuring the Horned Helmet. Based on TV, film, literature, video games, and all contemporary media, the Vikings are a heathen horde of war-hungry pirates who cremate their dead on burning longships, reject Christianity, and wear horned helmets into battle. Many folks at this point may have heard that the horned helmet is a myth, at least as far as the Vikings go, but even if we were beginning to know better, the iconography is still so pervasive that we've pretty much continued to see the Vikings as we did before, only now with a bit of a wink and a nudge, as if to say, we know, but this is more fun. But where did these ideas come from? Especially if they're so horribly wrong. Were they just invented? How did they become so universally agreed upon? Well, for that we can blame the Victorians. Well, the 19th century Europeans. The Victorians has a better ring to it, so forgive me this slight inaccuracy. As I hope to say many more times, the Victorians ruin everything. My first guest expert is Jimmy, known on YouTube as the Welsh Viking. Jimmy's channel is mostly devoted to talking about the Vikings, and he has studied the Vikings as well as the 19th century, so I felt like he was a natural choice to be a guest expert in my exploration of the Victorian approach to Vikings. You can see his channel in the card above or in the link below. I asked Jimmy to chat with me so that we could talk about who the Vikings were, debunk a few myths, and explore where all of our misconceptions about the Vikings came from, and was there a sliver of truth to any of the misconceptions, especially that silly horned helmet. First, let's establish some credentials and introduce Jimmy.
Oh my god, okay. Well, I'm Jimmy. I have been reenacting the Viking Age for 11, 12 years now. And that's been part of my undergraduate degree and my master's degree and now my PhD. So I've kind of been semi-researching the Vikings for like 12 years whilst I've been at academic institutions. I hang out with various archaeologists who specialise in the Viking Age quite a lot. I've dug up some Viking Age artefacts on the Isle of Man and in Ireland and in Wales. I've done some excavation. I've got a shelf full of books about the Viking Age over there, and I've read all of them, and most of them are decent. So yeah, I guess I'm just sort of accidentally immersed in the Viking Age, mostly.
Thanks, Jimmy. A quick disclaimer. This is a very brief examination of both the Viking Age and 19th century Europe. These are two very broad periods of time. We're concentrating mainly in Western Europe, and sometimes only the British Isles and parts of Scandinavia. The world is massive and diverse, and we are examining a very limited section of it in a very white Eurocentric fashion. This is due to the limitations of our information and expertise, and also the topic at hand. Many of the dates, concepts, and movements we discuss overlap, merge, or run parallel to each other. The study of history, if you're doing it right, is not cut and dried into simple definitions and timelines. It's weird, complicated, and mucky. We've done our best, and hope that you can take what we say with the grain of salt. For example, the word Victorians only refers to those who were subject to the direct rule of Queen Victoria from the years 1837 to 1901 in Britain, but I may occasionally slip up and use it to refer to people outside of that definition. Also, we will be touching on topics of nationalism, gender, and race during this video. If you're itching to make a comment which will contain the words liberal, leftist propaganda, or any other cutie pie political dog whistles, you will be deleted, so save yourself some time and see yourself out. I should also mention at this point that Jimmy and I, despite having known each other since April, had somehow never spoken face-to-face or screen-to-screen. We both only realized this when joining the meeting.
I don't think we've actually spoken like face-to-face, have we?
I know, I was actually thinking the same thing. Every time I was thinking about this chat, I was like, oh yeah, my friend Jimmy, like we're real tight. And then I was like, shit, we've never actually had a verbal conversation. Oops. I'm talking to you because I'm not a historian. For all that I joke about it, I'm a literature gal and I'm an amateur history enthusiast. So I did want to talk to somebody who'd actually done some decent scholarly research about this. So who are we talking about when we talk about the Vikings?
So when we, as like a globalized, digital, entertainment-centric society, talk about the Vikings, we're talking about Norse people from Northern Europe between about the 8th and the 11th/12th centuries. But when I, an intellectual, talk about Vikings, I am talking about people specifically from those Norse cultures who engaged in settling and raiding and trading activity basically across the old world and into Canada.
And that is, based on my very, very minor knowledge, that's because Viking is a profession, not a people.
Yeah, so Viking as an occupation rather than a culture is a really good way of putting it, I think, because and this kind of leads nicely into what we're going to talk about, is kind of in the 19th century, people started equating the Scandinavian settlement and kingdoms that were in Britain with the people who did the killing to help set those settlements up.
Oh, super.
Yes! But yeah, a Vikinger is a person who goes Viking. Vikinger is still a name in Scandinavian countries. You can still name your son Vikinger. Or daughter. Or, offspring. Gender is meaningless. I'm an archaeologist, I know.
So yeah, with that in mind, we were talking about the 19th century, and in sort of a very brief summary, in the 18th and 19th centuries, Europeans became interested in the Vikings again. My question in regards to that is, what did they know? Like, what was the information that they had that they were kind of cherry picking, obviously, somewhat? Is there any nugget of truth to what they were exploring?
So the kind of available information that they had, especially sort of at the start of the 19th century, sort of end of the 18th century, but more in the start of the 19th century, is a time where archaeology is kind of being born from this antiquary field of rich white men finding a lump in their back garden and then getting the local poor people to go dig it up for them to see what's there, and then dumping everything that's in it in their cabinet of curiosities back at the house, becoming something where some rich white men who are also university professors happen to have studied a few of these and kind of go, maybe we should apply some academic rigour to this and see if there is actually anything we can use these to teach us about the past. And sort of the nuggets there are things like they already knew that there were picture stones in Scandinavia. They already knew about the sagas, the Icelandic sagas. Like they had clues about Norse religion and Norse paganism or heathenism, whatever you prefer to call it, from manuscript evidence and books. Like, bearing in mind the sagas at that point were only 600 years old, so they'd been copied relatively recently. But what they didn't have was a network of academic information like we have now available to us. Like, I can now go online and I can look at every single artifact dug from Viking Age York online for free that's been dug up in the last 150 years plus. Whereas in 1830, Sir Giles has 2 books on the Vikings with virtually no archaeological evidence, no carbon-14 dating. Like, they don't really know. He found somebody with a sword in his back garden, therefore it's a Viking warrior. Whereas, 150 years later, it turns out to have been not a Viking warrior. Who knows what it was? It was just somebody who owned a sword, or was given a sword. So the nuggets of truth are things like, they were a very violent people. They were raiders and warriors. They practiced their own pagan religion before being Christianized. They had gods like Odin and Thor and Frigga and Hela and people like that. But then around all of that is, like you were saying, this romantic nationalism of they were all white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people who were great in bed and whatever other myths that you wanted to lay on them, you could, right? Because there was no one to criticize you. There was no established narrative that, well, no, they were a complex people with a very similar system of government and royalty to the rest of Europe in the period. Everyone was like, no, the Vikings are special because they're cool and they've got picture stones and they've got weird language that no one can read.
And that kills me, because I think that you say something like, the Vikings were violent people who were raiders, and I was thinking to myself, most of the history that people read from the medieval period is war and fighting and, territorial battles, and you think, like, why are these people special? And I think it was just because they were so much other that it was easy to kind of take all of their stuff and be like, no, this is a special version of all of this stuff that is fairly the same.
Yeah, it is absolutely. I think it's intentional othering of the Norse, not just of like the Norse people. I think that's part of why people equate Norsemen with Vikings. Is, well, if these guys are different, then everybody at home had to be different. If the people in the longships are these superhuman pagan warriors who write in runes and have berserkers, then the people back home must also have been these strange, savage people from the cold, frozen north. Whereas in fact, they're like, King Harold of Norway speaks French. Harald Hardrada lived in the Byzantine Empire. Like, he spent a lot of time in Italy. These are just Europeans. They just don't write in the Latin alphabet and they don't go to church on Sunday until AD 1000. And then they do, so...
Okay, here's your first break for a definition and brief historical summary which will prep you for the topics that Jimmy and I dive into in this conversation without much ceremony. Romanticism was a movement from around the first half of the 19th century, which most people will recognize from the literature of Lord Byron, Keats, and all of the Shelleys, the art of Turner and Delacroix, and the music of Beethoven and Verdi. This movement was in reaction to several different factors leading up to the 19th century, including large-scale industrialization, a shift to concentrated urban centers, as well as the 18th century intellectual preoccupation with the Greek and Roman classics and rationalism. We could so easily go down a rabbit hole of movements and counter-movements here, but here's a basic comparison. The classicists revered the Greeks and Romans for their architecture, their philosophy, their art, and their method of governance. And like we still do today, they brought some of these styles back for a revival. Remember when we brought back hippie culture in the 1990s? It's like that, only more extra. And I didn't have to live through it. This is the reason for Louis XVI's building miniature Grecian-style temples in his enormous palace at Versailles, and why a lot of 18th century pottery evokes a kind of callback to Grecian urns. They loved the great thinkers and philosophers of the ancient world, and the Enlightenment was heavily influenced by these thinkers and the way they explored thoughts and ideas. Even the flowy columnar gowns of the Regency fashion were a callback to the loose, draping peplos of ancient Greek women. By contrast, the Romantics revered nature and naturalness, and focused very strongly on the individual and on that individual's rich inner feelings. They valued an aesthetic experience, by which I mean evoking strong emotions with nature, poetry, literature, and beauty in general. Not always good emotions either. Horror and disgust were just as valued as the swooning of love or the ecstasy of a landscape. To be taken over by a piece of art or the natural beauty of a place was very important. For their historical revival, they were much more taken with the perceived wildness and romance of medieval Europe, which was viewed as less postured and more in tune with nature than the cold and sterile marble of the classicists. I have a whole other video planned for Arthurian romances, which were a special preoccupation for the Romantics. Oh, it's so weird. It's so interesting, but it's so weird.
I've been reading loads of the earliest manuscripts we've got of them, and they're just, compared to all of the romanticized Victorian and Hollywood stuff, it's just batshit. It's great. Like, I turned him into a pig. Why? It was my will.
Cool.
Alright, yeah. And now I'm going to have sex with him. Okay! Okay.
Along with all of this romanticism in art and literature, there was also a strong sense of personal identity and a sense of shared spirit and collective inner feeling, and that leads us to romantic nationalism. The 19th century is where the term zeitgeist kind of became popular, this idea of the spirit of the age, the spirit of a people, the ideas and values being a thing that unite people. It's really new. It's not an old concept.
No, and it's not a concept that the Vikings would have recognised. It's not a concept that the Norse would have recognised in the Viking period.
Romantic nationalism was a part of the broader Romanticism movement, and, in an incredibly small nutshell, was about a sense of national identity that was based on shared values, history, culture, and ideas of its citizens, rather than a national identity flowing from the dictates of the monarch or a higher power. This is actually a kind of nationalism that is still very popular today. We often build our sense of national identities on things we share culturally, like Canadians being polite and accommodating, or the English loving tea. But even at the beginning of this video, you made a joke about how I apologized profusely for 15 minutes about mistaking the time that we were meeting as a Canadian thing.
Yeah.
And there's no Canadian culture. Even if you were to talk about Indigenous peoples, there's hundreds of Indigenous nations. So there's no Canadian culture. It's not a thing. It's not even one continent because it's contiguous with all of the rest of North America.
Exactly.
So we've constructed this identity that is about values, but it's not about values. And it's very weird. And I think it happens if you want a really good and devilishly complex example of this, do some reading on national identity in the USA. I'm not talking about personal politics here. I'm talking about the kind of ingrained national origin story that gives us not only things like The West Wing, Hamilton, and The Legend of John Henry, but also makes folk heroes of Al Capone, Butch Cassidy, and Billy the Kid. The 19th century saw huge changes in geopolitical boundaries and unified a lot of areas which were formerly only tacitly related to each other. So it made sense that this was a time when people began to have this different perspective towards shared culture and nationhood. This manifested in all sorts of ways, but one of the major ways was a collective cultural mythology and history. And while sometimes these ideas occurred naturally, other times they were more suggested by a governing body or culturally influential individuals. The discovery of Nordic texts in the late 18th and early 19th century and their subsequent translations and publications created a renewed interest in the Vikings. And from what I can discern, the renewed interest in Vikings and a search for national identities was almost a fluke of timing, but it had a stunning effect. People in Germany, Britain, and several other nations in Europe began hearkening back to an earlier time in their shared history, which somehow always had a flavor of Viking, if not totally claiming Viking history as their own.
When you kind of take it in the context of the unification of Germany that's happening as well, right? Because they have to have a unified culture. And if you're trying to unify a country that is in the north, like the original Angles and Saxons who settled Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries, and in the south is people with more in common with the Lombards and the Italian states than northern Germany. Like, you have to have something that unites them, and with opera being like the popular artistic form of the period, oh well shucks, why don't we take one of these Viking myths and say this is a pan-Germanic cultural thing that can unify us all into the First Reich. And it worked. It worked because people still associate it with Germanic culture. 150 years later, but places like Britain trying to associate themselves with the Roman Empire and the legitimizing of the Scottish kings by trying to trace their lineage back to King Arthur. It's all nonsense.
By the way, I cut out about 200 words from this script that pertained to Beowulf because I was getting so deep in the weeds I was never going to come out again. Suffice it to say that academics have been divided about the meaning, provenance, date, and cultural milieu of Beowulf since the manuscript was first examined, and that's a lot. But for a fun fact, there was a brief time when certain scholars were doing their best to prove that Queen Victoria was descended from Viking royalty. She wasn't.
I kind of have to use Britain as the example because it's where most of my research takes place, but kind of in the sort of 17th and 18th century where you get, well, what makes you British? Well, I don't bloody know. I was born here, I guess. I pay taxes. Here, I suppose. Oh, well, let's go to war with France. Okay. It's not a cultural war. It's because, we don't like them for insert reason here this year. We want Calais back. Whatever it might be. Who cares? But yeah, in the 19th century, it has to be our culture is founded on this overarching principle that was established 1,000 years ago. And yeah, the idea of that being something the Vikings recognise is completely mystifying to me, because people all the time just cherry pick aspects of Viking culture, put them all together with, a mortar made of runes, and think that that's what it was like. Where, oh yeah, they hated Christians and were a violent and warlike culture. Whereas, they converted to Christianity over like 2 generations. They traded with everybody they met. Like, they adapted their culture depending on where they were. They adapted their artistic culture especially. So from their first contact with the Irish to about 50 years later, everything in the archaeology becomes Irish. Like, everything in Viking archaeology suddenly has this weird Celtic twinge to it. Like, they didn't have this sort of solidified, this is our national culture, and we hand it on to you, 19th century Europe, to preserve your strength. Like, no, it's just...
So what about the horned helmet? All of these tidbits of the sort of cultural iconography that we have of the Vikings are all, as far as I know, the inventions of the Victorians and the late sort of Georgians, and that makes it sound like they're all English. I mean, sort of the late 18th century, early 19th century Europeans, we talk about like Wagnerian opera as being the source of, like, a bunch of people have sourced that as the origin of the horned helmet. I've heard different, or that it's somewhat contested.
There is a Norse depiction of a horned helmet from a tapestry, I think from Osseberg, that shows somebody at the front of what's been interpreted as a religious procession wearing a helmet with horns on it. And then there is a pre-Viking depiction on a helmet that didn't have horns on it, of people in helmets with horns on them. Those are the 2 medieval, like Viking period and slightly earlier depictions of horned helmets. And then when those were excavated and publicised in the 19th century, I think everybody just went, oh boy! And just ran with it and was like, they had horns on their hats! Tell everyone! And we have a Celtic helmet, like I think it's Roman or pre-Roman helmet from the River Thames that has horns on it. Weird, conical, nipply horns. In the 19th century, people associated that with the Vikings, even though it's from like 100 BC. It's people just kind of... I think, again, this is a problem where if there's no academic rigour and there's no kind of reviewing of the research, people can just take stuff and run with it, and everybody goes, huh, cool, didn't know that.
Yeah, the sort of like the layman, noted, somebody who has information has told me a thing, and I trust them to have the information.
And it's a YouTube thing as well, right? Like, people listen to me on my channel and they're like, wow, thanks for the info, and I'm like, I could be lying. I'm not, God, but,
I really appreciate the idea of talking about academic rigor as being something where it's not just somebody providing information based on their information, it's other people checking up on it and comparing it to other people's research and proving that you've compared it to other people's research and all that jazz. So why are the ideas that we have about the Vikings, which are so wrong, still around? Why do you think that these mistaken ideas about the Vikings were so sticky in like the public consciousness? Why hasn't any of the new research come across to kind of erase that old notion of what the Vikings were like?
I think a lot of it is to do with it being a part of popular culture. So like the Wagnerian aspect of it with the Valkyries and the horned helmets, with the kind of the social and religious culture of the Vikings being reinforced with popular culture, so films and TV and books and radio dramas. You even have things like the pulp novels of the 20s and 30s, right? Like the Conan the Barbarian style novels that takes everything that was currently known about the ancient world, Bronze Age, Iron Age and otherwise, and just kind of mashes it together to make it a swords and sorcery epic. Like, that's way more appealing than somebody in a lecture theatre saying, well, actually, in 998, when Christianity was just beginning to take effect in Norway, we see a little more advancement in the way that sumptuary law, like, it's just sexier. I think it's because they're sexy ideas. Like, it's a sexy idea that this longboat full of long-haired madmen with axes arrives and plunges the world into chaos. It's much sexier than some people on a boat turned up. They had like a smattering of your language and said, hi, trade, farming, maybe we have beer. Like, it's not as sexy as like Ulfberth the Mighty with his two-handed axe swinging his chopper around Northern Europe. Like,
oh man, yeah, that's fair enough. You started studying the Vikings in a more casual way in your undergraduate degree, is that right? Like, it wasn't really what your undergraduate degree was about?
No, my undergraduate degree was archaeology. It was ancient history and archaeology. So it was, I was mostly studying things like the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, but I started seriously researching in its own right the Viking Age during that, yeah.
So before that, how much of what we've been talking about with the sort of popular culture and cultural perception of the Vikings, how much of that did you have to kind of unlearn? Was that something that you'd had?
All of it, yeah, all of it. Honestly, prior to starting in my second year of undergrad reenacting the Vikings, I was the layest of laymen. I knew nothing about the Viking period. I knew that they wrote in runes. I knew that the Norwegians helped the Welsh at a battle once against the Normans, because Wales, and that was it. I had no knowledge of the material culture beyond, like, axes and longboats. I was kind of like the Taoist unworked block. I knew nothing. Lay the knowledge on me. I had to unlearn some of it. I had to unlearn a lot of the kind of, they were just barbarians. It didn't take long. Like, if you immerse yourself in a living history group, it's not long before people start bringing you artifacts and, you know, replicas of stuff that they found, and you go, oh my god, they had those. Like, wow, they had ice skates? Cool. Like, oh, musical instruments. Of course they had musical instruments. Like, you know, things like that. But yeah, I had to unlearn a lot.
The name of this series is Victorians Ruin Everything. But they didn't really. They were just the loudest in a long line of shouting about the past and the present. The birth of cheap and accessible print media, plus massively increased literacy, meant that more people than ever had the wrong information, and passed it along faster due to the ever-increasing technological advancements of the century. They were limited in their knowledge, and working within a limited view of a still fairly mercurial world. That's not to say that they didn't make mistakes, and there were definitely problems with their ideas, but humans like to tell stories, and it is our natural inclination to fill in the blanks when we don't have all of the information. We like stories, and we like to feel we are part of something bigger than ourselves. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but so often creating a self comes at the expense of creating an other as well.
You know, if you tell somebody that this is our culture, that automatically others every other culture in the world, right? That's same in Canada. You know, if you tell people that Canadian culture is Tim Hortons and apologising and hockey and, you know, going to the cottage in the summer for a couple of weeks and what have you, wearing buffalo plaid shirts. Canadian culture is therefore not whatever Micmac culture is, you know? Yeah. Automatically.
Jimmy's comment about Micmac culture didn't come out of nowhere. Micmac fishing rights have been threatened recently, subjecting them not only to a lengthy legal battle, but also racist vitriol, violence, threats, and property damage. Please learn how you can support these folks in their ongoing struggle at the link below, micmacrights.com.
And it's the same with Vikings. You know, if Viking culture is not being Christian, writing in runes, and being violent, and being blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and an ubermensch, automatically, whatever anyone else's culture is, bad. Wrong.
Man, we were not going to get through this conversation without dropping the ubermensch word.
We weren't, no. I was trying so hard.
Oh boy. This soapbox doesn't look like a powder keg at all. Jimmy and I could have talked about this non-stop for several days. Both of us have similar feelings when it comes to the difficult line you walk when studying history and reenacting history. You have to reckon with the bad as much as the good, and how the good and bad influences continue to reverberate through our world to this day. Now, more than ever, question what you know. Ask yourself why you think you know something. Ask yourself why you were told what you were told, and why some things may have been left out. If you're unsure, or if different information makes you feel bad, find out why. Dig deeper. This is the important part. I'm going to end now with a quote from Carlo Rovelli, who is one of my favorite science communicators and wrote an amazing book which I think everybody should read, called 7 Brief Lessons on Physics. When we talk about the Big Bang or the fabric of space, what we are doing is not a continuation of the free and fantastic stories that humans told nightly around campfires for hundreds of thousands of years. It is the continuation of something else, of the gaze of those same humans in the first light of day, looking at tracts left by antelope in the dust of the savannah, scrutinizing and deducting from the details of reality in order to pursue something that we can't see directly, but can follow the traces of, in the awareness that we can always be wrong, and therefore ready at any moment to change direction if a new track appears, but also knowing that if we are good enough, we will get it right and find what we are seeking. I hope that you can find what you are seeking, but in the meantime, let us work together to make sure we never put another horned helmet on a picture of a Viking ever again. Deal? If you'd like to support me or Jimmy, or both, please follow the Ko-fi links below to support our video making efforts. I am so happy we were able to do this, and I hope I can do more in the future. Please subscribe for the fantastic wintry December I have planned for you all. Thanks for watching!